Hello everyone. Tonight we'll explore what medieval prison food was actually like, and the harsh realities of life behind bars in the Middle Ages. Feel free to say hi in the comments. Let me know what time you're watching this, and where you're tuning in from, if you'd like. Picture this. You're walking through the damp stone corridors of a medieval castle, and you hear the echo of your footsteps bouncing off the walls. The air is thick with moisture, and there's a musty smell that seems to cling to everything. You're not here as a guest though. You're here to understand what life was like for those who found themselves on the wrong side of medieval justice. When we think about medieval prisons today, we often imagine dark dungeons with chains and torture devices. While those certainly existed, the reality of medieval imprisonment was often quite different from what we see in movies. Most importantly, the food situation was far more complex than just bread and water. Let's start with the basics. In medieval times, there wasn't really a unified prison system like we have today. Instead, imprisonment varied dramatically depending on who you were, what you'd done, and where you ended up. A nobleman caught in a political dispute might find himself in relatively comfortable quarters in a castle tower, while a common thief could end up in the local jail with conditions that were, well, let's just say they wouldn't pass modern health inspections. The food you received as a prisoner depended heavily on your social status and your ability to pay. This might sound strange to us today, but medieval prisons operated more like a business than a public service. The jailer, or prison keeper, was usually responsible for providing food, but they expected to be paid for it. If you had money or family who could pay, you might eat reasonably well. If you didn't, things got difficult quickly. For those who could afford it, medieval prison food could actually be quite decent. Records from the Tower of London show that some prisoners were served meat, fish, ale, and bread regularly. One account from the 14th century describes a prisoner receiving beef, mutton, chicken, and even wine. Of course, this was for someone of considerable means and importance, but what about the average person who found themselves behind bars? This is where things get interesting, and frankly pretty grim. The standard prison fare for common prisoners was typically bread and water, but even this basic meal had variations. The bread wasn't the fluffy white bread we know today. Medieval prison bread was often made from a mixture of grains, sometimes including barley, oats, and even peas or beans when wheat was scarce. This bread was usually dark, dense, and often stale. It was baked in large batches and could sit around for days before being distributed. The water was, well, water, though in many medieval prisons it came from wells or streams that weren't always the cleanest. Sometimes prisoners were lucky enough to get weak ale instead of water, which was actually safer to drink in many cases. Let me paint you a picture of what mealtime might have looked like in a typical medieval prison. The sun is just beginning to peek through the small barred window high up on the stone wall. You can hear the jailer's heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor, accompanied by the clinking of keys and the scraping of wooden bowls. The jailer appears at your cell door, a gruff man with weathered hands and a no-nonsense attitude. He slides a wooden bowl through the small opening at the bottom of the door. Inside is a chunk of dark bread, hard as a rock, and a small cup of water that has a slightly muddy taste. There's your morning meal, the jailer might say. If you want more, you'll need to pay for it, or have someone on the outside send money. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of medieval prison food, the role of family and friends. Prisoners who had people on the outside looking out for them had a much better chance of eating well. Family members could bring food, pay the jailer for better meals, or even hire servants to cook for their imprisoned relatives. Some prisons had arrangements with local taverns or inns to provide meals for prisoners who could pay. A prisoner might receive a hot meal of stew, bread, and ale for a few coins. The stew would typically contain whatever vegetables were in season, perhaps some meat, if they were lucky, and would be served in a wooden bowl with a wooden spoon. The contrast between rich and poor prisoners was stark. While a wealthy prisoner might enjoy roasted meats, fresh bread, and imported wines, a poor prisoner might survive on nothing but bread and water for weeks or even months. Some prisoners became so desperate for food that they would eat anything they could find, including straw from their bedding or scraps that fell from other prisoners' meals. Interestingly, medieval prisons sometimes allowed prisoners to work to earn money for food. Some prisoners were permitted to practice their trades from inside the prison. A shoemaker might make shoes, a scribe might write letters, or a craftsman might create small items to sell. The money earned could then be used to buy better food from the jailer, or from vendors who were allowed to visit the prison. Speaking of vendors, many medieval prisons allowed food sellers to come inside and sell their wares to prisoners who could afford them. These vendors, often women from the local community, would carry baskets of bread, cheese, fruits, and other foods. They might call out their wares as they walked through the prison corridors. Fresh bread, cheese, apples, they might shout, and prisoners with money would call back, "Here, over here." The prices were often inflated, since the vendors knew they had a captive audience. But for prisoners who could afford it, these vendors provided a welcome break from the monotonous prison fare. Now let's talk about the actual preparation and distribution of food in medieval prisons. Most prisons had a basic kitchen area where the jailer or his assistants would prepare meals. This wasn't a fancy operation by any means. Picture a room with a large fireplace, some iron pots, wooden bowls, and basic cooking utensils. The cooking was usually done in large batches. A big pot of porridge or stew might be made to feed multiple prisoners. The porridge was often made from oats or barley, sometimes with a bit of meat or vegetables thrown in if the prison budget allowed for it. The consistency was usually thick and gluey, not particularly appetizing but filling enough to keep prisoners from starving. Bread was either baked on site or purchased from local bakers. The prison bread was usually the cheapest grade available, made from coarse flour and often containing bits of bran or other additives. It was baked in large flat loaves that could be easily divided among prisoners. Water was drawn from wells, streams, or collected rainwater. In some prisons, prisoners were responsible for drawing their own water from a communal well in the prison courtyard. In others, the jailer would distribute water along with the bread. The distribution of food was usually done twice a day, morning and evening. Prisoners would gather at their cell doors, and the jailer would make his rounds, sliding bowls of food through the small openings. The whole process was efficient, but not particularly dignified. Next, the jailer might call out as he moved from cell to cell, "Hold out your bowl. Don't spill it, that's all you're getting." The bowls and cups used in medieval prisons were typically made of wood or cheap pottery. Prisoners were expected to keep track of their own eating utensils and bowls. If you lost your bowl, you might have to eat with your hands or find some other way to manage. Some prisoners carved their own bowls from wood or fashioned cups from whatever materials they could find. Cleanliness was, understandably, a major issue. There was no running water for washing dishes, and soap was a luxury that most prisoners couldn't afford. Bowls and cups were often just wiped clean with straw or rags, if they were cleaned at all. This led to various health problems, including dysentery and other stomach ailments. The seasonal availability of food also played a major role in what prisoners ate. In the summer and fall, when fresh fruits and vegetables were available, prisoners with money might be able to purchase apples, pears, onions, or cabbage from vendors. In the winter, the diet became much more limited, consisting mainly of preserved foods like salted meat, dried fish, and root vegetables that could be stored for long periods. During harvest time, even poor prisoners might receive slightly better food. Prisons often had arrangements with local farms to purchase surplus grain at reduced prices. This meant that autumn meals might include fresher bread or porridge made from newly harvested grain. Let me describe what a typical medieval prison meal might have looked like during different seasons. In spring, prisoners might receive thin porridge made from the last of the winter grain stores, perhaps with some early greens or onions added if they were available. The bread would be getting stale from winter storage, but there might be hope for better food as the growing season began. Summer brought the possibility of fresh vegetables and fruits. A prisoner with money might enjoy bread with cheese, fresh berries, or vegetables from local gardens. The wealthy prisoners might even have access to fresh fish or poultry. For poor prisoners, the basic fare remained bread and water, but the bread might be fresher and the water cleaner, as wells were replenished by summer rains. Fall was often the best time for prison food. Harvest brought fresh grain for bread, and there was usually a surplus of vegetables and fruits. Even poor prisoners might receive slightly larger portions, or better quality bread. Meat was also more readily available as livestock was slaughtered before winter. Winter was the harshest time. Food became scarce and expensive. Prisoners relied heavily on preserved foods like salted pork, dried fish, and root vegetables. The bread became coarser as better grains were reserved for those who could pay premium prices. Many prisoners survived primarily on thin porridge and whatever scraps they could obtain. The role of charity in feeding prisoners was also significant in medieval times. The church often encouraged charitable giving to prisoners, and many wealthy individuals would donate food or money to improve prison conditions. Some monasteries had regular arrangements to provide food to local prisons. "Remember those in prison, as if you were their fellow prisoners," was a common saying, and many took this seriously. Local guilds and communities sometimes organized collections to provide food for prisoners during religious holidays or times of particular hardship. Christmas was often a time when prisoners received special meals. Wealthy donors might provide meat, ale, and even sweets for prisoners. Some prisons had traditional Christmas feasts where prisoners received better food than usual. Of course, this generosity was sporadic and depended on the goodwill of the community. The business aspect of medieval prisons created some interesting dynamics around food. Jailers often had side businesses selling food and other necessities to prisoners. They might mark up prices significantly, knowing that prisoners had little choice but to pay. Some jailers became quite wealthy through these practices. A conversation between a jailer and a prisoner might go something like this. "I've got fresh bread today, but it'll cost you extra," the jailer might say. "How much extra?" the prisoner would ask. "3 times the usual price. Take it or leave it." "That's robbery." "Well, you're already in prison. What's a little more trouble?" This kind of exploitation was common, though some jailers were more fair-minded than others. The relationship between jailer and prisoner was crucial in determining the quality of food and treatment a prisoner received. Some prisons had what we might call meal plans for prisoners who could afford them. A prisoner might pay a weekly or monthly fee to receive regular meals of a certain quality. This might include bread, porridge, meat once or twice a week, and ale or wine. The quality of these meal plans varied widely. A basic plan might provide enough food to survive, while a premium plan could include fresh meat daily, wine, cheese, and other luxuries. The prices were often astronomical compared to what the same food would cost outside the prison. Food preparation in medieval prisons was generally quite basic. Most meals were boiled or stewed in large pots over open fires. Roasting was less common because it required more fuel and attention. Seasoning was minimal, usually just salt when it was available. The typical prison kitchen would have large iron pots for cooking porridge and stew, wooden ladles for serving, and simple storage areas for grain and other ingredients. The cooking was usually done by the jailer's wife or servants, or sometimes by prisoners themselves if they were trusted. "Stir that pot," the cook might call out to a prisoner helper. "Don't let it burn, or there'll be nothing to eat tonight." The smells from the prison kitchen were often the highlight of a prisoner's day. The aroma of cooking food, even simple porridge, would waft through the corridors and remind prisoners of their hunger and their longing for freedom. Water quality was a constant concern in medieval prisons. Many prisons were built near rivers or streams, but the water wasn't always clean. Prisoners often preferred ale or wine when they could get it, not just for the alcohol content but because the brewing process made these beverages safer to drink than water. Some prisons had their own wells, which provided cleaner water than surface sources. However, these wells sometimes became contaminated, especially in crowded prisons where sanitation was poor. Prisoners would sometimes complain about the taste or smell of the water, but they had little choice but to drink it. The social dynamics around food in medieval prisons were complex. Prisoners who received good food from family or friends sometimes shared with less fortunate prisoners. This created alliances and friendships that could be crucial for survival. "Here, take some of this bread," a well-fed prisoner might say to a starving cellmate. "I can't eat it all anyway." This kind of generosity was common, though not universal. Some prisoners hoarded their food jealously, knowing that they might not know where their next meal was coming from. The sharing of food also created hierarchies among prisoners. Those who could afford better food often became informal leaders, using their resources to gain influence and protection. They might offer food in exchange for services or protection from other prisoners. Religious observances also affected prison food. During Lent, even prisoners were expected to fast or eat only simple foods. Some prisons provided fish instead of meat during religious fasting periods, though this was often seen as a luxury rather than a hardship. "It's Friday," the jailer might announce. "No meat today. You'll get fish if you can pay for it. Otherwise it's bread and water." Some prisoners used religious observances to their advantage, claiming to need special diets for religious reasons. This didn't always work, but sympathetic jailers sometimes accommodated these requests. The preparation of food for sick prisoners was another important aspect of medieval prison nutrition. Prisoners who became ill often needed special diets, and those who could afford it might receive broth, porridge, or other easily digestible foods. Prison physicians, when they existed, would sometimes prescribe special diets for sick prisoners. These might include wine for strength, honey for coughs, or special herbs for various ailments. Of course, these prescriptions were only followed if the prisoner could pay for the special food. "The physician says you need broth and wine," the jailer might tell a sick prisoner, "but it'll cost you extra." "I'll pay," the prisoner might wheeze. "Just bring me something to help me get better." The role of prison gardens was also significant in some medieval prisons. Larger prisons sometimes had gardens where vegetables and herbs were grown to supplement the prison diet. These gardens were usually tended by prisoners, who were trusted and had some knowledge of farming. Working in the prison garden was often seen as a privilege, as it provided fresh air, exercise, and access to fresh vegetables. Prisoners who worked in the gardens might be allowed to eat some of the produce they grew, which was a significant improvement over the usual prison fare. "The beans are ready for harvest," a prisoner gardener might say to his fellow workers. "We'll eat well tonight if the jailer lets us keep some." The seasonal nature of these gardens meant that fresh vegetables were only available during growing season, but they provided a welcome break from the monotonous diet of bread and porridge. Food storage was a constant challenge in medieval prisons. Without refrigeration, food had to be consumed quickly or preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. Grain was stored in sacks or barrels, but it was vulnerable to rats, mice, and insects. Prisoners often had to deal with contaminated food. Moldy bread, spoiled meat, and infested grain were common problems. Some prisoners became skilled at identifying and avoiding bad food, while others had no choice but to eat whatever they were given. "This bread is moldy," a prisoner might complain. "Then don't eat it," the jailer might reply. "But that's all you're getting today." The threat of starvation was real for prisoners who couldn't afford to buy food. Some prisoners became so desperate that they would eat almost anything, including things that weren't really food at all. The economics of medieval prison food created a complex system of debts and obligations. Prisoners who couldn't pay for food might go into debt to the jailer, promising to pay when they were released or when family members could provide money. These debts could keep prisoners in jail long after their original sentences were completed. Some prisoners remained imprisoned for years, not because of their original crimes, but because they couldn't pay their food bills. "You owe me 15 shillings for food," the jailer might tell a prisoner who was supposed to be released. "But I don't have 15 shillings, the prisoner would reply. "Then you're not leaving until you do." This system created a cycle of poverty and imprisonment that was difficult to escape. Families sometimes had to choose between keeping their imprisoned relatives fed and meeting their own basic needs. The quality of prison food also varied dramatically between different types of prisons. Royal prisons, which held political prisoners and important criminals, often had much better food than local jails. Ecclesiastical prisons, run by the church, sometimes provided better care for prisoners, seeing imprisonment as an opportunity for spiritual rehabilitation. Military prisons had their own characteristics. Prisoners of war might be treated better or worse depending on political relationships and the prospect of prisoner exchanges. Some military prisoners were held in relatively comfortable conditions, while others were treated harshly. "We're holding you until your king pays your ransom," a captor might tell a prisoner of war. "Until then, you'll eat what we give you and be grateful for it." The treatment of prisoners of war was often governed by codes of chivalry and honor, which sometimes included provisions for adequate food and shelter. However, these codes were not always followed, especially during times of bitter conflict. Urban prisons, located in cities and towns, often had access to a wider variety of foods than rural prisons. City prisons might have arrangements with multiple vendors, bakers, and taverns to provide food for prisoners. They also had access to imported foods and luxury items that weren't available in rural areas. Rural prisons, on the other hand, were often more dependent on local agriculture and seasonal availability. They might have better access to fresh produce during harvest time, but they also faced greater hardships during times of scarcity. The prison food system also reflected the broader social and economic structures of medieval society. The fact that prisoners had to pay for their own food reinforced class distinctions and ensured that even in prison, the wealthy received better treatment than the poor. This system seems harsh to us today, but it was consistent with medieval ideas about justice and social order. The concept of the state providing for prisoners' basic needs was largely foreign to medieval thinking. Imprisonment was seen as a punishment, and suffering was considered part of that punishment. The role of women in the medieval prison food system was also significant. Jailers' wives often did the cooking, and female vendors were common in many prisons. Some prisons employed women specifically to cook for prisoners, recognizing that women were often more skilled in food preparation. The jailer's wife makes the best porridge. Prisoners might say to each other, "It's still not good, but it's better than what we had before." Female prisoners faced additional challenges around food. Pregnant prisoners needed special diets, and nursing mothers required extra nutrition. Some prisons made accommodations for these needs, while others did not. The contrast between medieval prison food and the food available to free people was stark. While free peasants might struggle to find enough to eat during bad harvests, they at least had the opportunity to forage, hunt, or trade for food. Prisoners had no such options. The psychological impact of poor food was also significant. Hunger was a constant companion for many prisoners, and the anticipation of meals became one of the few things prisoners had to look forward to. The distribution of food became a significant event in the prison routine. "Food time," the jailer might call out, and prisoners would gather at their cell doors, eager for their meager rations. The sound of the jailer's footsteps and the clinking of bowls became associated with relief from hunger, even if the food itself was barely adequate. Some prisoners developed elaborate fantasies about the foods they would eat when they were released. They might spend hours discussing favorite dishes, family recipes, or foods they had enjoyed in the past. These conversations helped pass the time and provided some psychological comfort. "When I get out of here," a prisoner might say to his cellmate, "the first thing I'm going to do is eat a proper meal. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, ale, maybe some cheese." "Don't torture yourself," the cellmate might reply. "We've got to make do with what we have." The reality of medieval prison food was that it was designed to keep prisoners alive, not to provide comfort or pleasure. The goal was minimal nutrition at minimal cost, with the expectation that prisoners or their families would pay for anything better. This approach to prison food reflected broader medieval attitudes toward punishment and justice. Suffering was seen as an appropriate consequence for wrongdoing, and comfort was considered a privilege that had to be earned or purchased. The long-term health effects of medieval prison food were severe. Many prisoners developed malnutrition, scurvy, and other diseases related to poor diet. Those who survived long prison sentences often emerged in poor health, with lasting effects from their inadequate nutrition. Despite these harsh conditions, the human spirit often found ways to adapt and survive. Prisoners developed strategies for making the most of their limited food, sharing resources with others, and maintaining hope for better days ahead. The medieval prison food system, with all its flaws and cruelties, provides us with a window into the values and social structures of the time. It reminds us how far we've come in our understanding of human rights and the proper treatment of prisoners. Today, we recognize that adequate nutrition is a basic human right, even for those who have broken the law. The medieval approach to prison food, where prisoners had to pay for their own sustenance, seems almost unimaginably harsh to modern sensibilities. Yet understanding this history helps us appreciate the progress that has been made in criminal justice and human rights. The dark corridors and meager meals of medieval prisons remind us of the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. As we've seen, medieval prison food was far more complex than just bread and water. It was a system that reflected the social, economic, and moral values of the time, with all their contradictions and inequalities. But let's dive even deeper into the specific types of food that prisoners actually ate, starting with the bread that formed the backbone of most prison diets. Medieval bread came in many varieties, and the type you received depended entirely on your status and ability to pay. The finest bread was called manchet, made from white wheat flour and reserved for the wealthy. This bread was soft, white, and considered a luxury item. Most prisoners, however, received what was called muslin bread, made from a mixture of wheat and rye. This bread was darker, denser, and had a coarser texture than manchet. It was more filling and actually more nutritious than white bread, though it was considered inferior by medieval standards. For the poorest prisoners, the bread was often made from barley, oats, or even peas and beans when grain was scarce. This bread was very dark, extremely dense, and often had a bitter taste. Some prisoners described it as being so hard that it had to be soaked in water or ale before it could be eaten. This bread could break your teeth. A prisoner might complain to his cellmate. "At least we have bread," would come the reply. Some days we might not even get that. The process of making prison bread was quite different from the careful baking done in wealthy households. Prison bread was made in large batches, often using whatever grain was cheapest and most readily available. The dough was mixed with just flour, water, and sometimes a bit of salt if it was available. The ovens used for baking prison bread were large, communal ovens that could bake many loaves at once. The bread was often baked until it was very hard, partly to make it last longer and partly because the bakers didn't always pay careful attention to the timing. A hard crust helped preserve the bread, which was important since it might sit around for days before being eaten. Now let's talk about the porridge that was another staple of medieval prison diets. Prison porridge was usually made from oats, barley, or whatever grain was available. It was cooked in large iron pots over open fires, stirred with long wooden spoons to prevent it from sticking to the bottom. The consistency of prison porridge varied depending on how much water was added and how long it was cooked. Sometimes it was thin and watery, more like a soup than what we would consider porridge today. Other times it was thick and gluey, almost impossible to swallow without plenty of water. The porridge is like glue again today. Prisoners might grumble as they received their wooden bowls. "Better than no porridge at all," another might respond, though neither prisoner was particularly happy about the situation. The flavor of prison porridge was usually bland at best. Salt was expensive and not always available, so most porridge was simply cooked grain and water. Sometimes, if prisoners were lucky, a bit of fat or meat scraps might be added to give it some flavor and nutrition. During harvest time, prison porridge might be made with fresher grain, which improved the taste considerably. New oats or barley had a nuttier, more pleasant flavor than grain that had been stored for months. However, this improvement was temporary, lasting only until the fresh grain was used up. Let's explore the meat that some prisoners were fortunate enough to receive. For those who could afford it, meat was usually served once or twice a week. The type of meat varied depending on what was available and affordable. Beef and mutton were the most common, though pork was also served occasionally. The quality of prison meat was generally poor. It was often tough, sometimes spoiled, and usually the cheapest cuts available. Prison cooks would typically boil the meat in large pots to make it more tender and to create a broth that could be served alongside the meat. "The meat is tough as leather," a prisoner might complain. "Chew it slowly and be grateful," another might advise. "Tomorrow we might only get bread." Fish was also served in some prisons, particularly during religious fasting periods when meat was forbidden. The fish was usually salted or dried fish that had been stored for long periods. Fresh fish was rare and expensive, reserved for wealthy prisoners who could pay premium prices. The preparation of fish in medieval prisons was usually quite simple. Dried fish might be soaked in water to soften it, then boiled or added to porridge. Salted fish was often served as is, though it was sometimes cooked to make it more palatable. Water, as we've discussed, was the most common beverage in medieval prisons, but the quality of this water varied dramatically from prison to prison. Some prisons were built near clean springs or wells, providing relatively good water. Others had to rely on river water, which was often contaminated with waste and runoff. The taste of medieval prison water was often described as muddy, metallic, or bitter. Prisoners learned to identify the cleanest water available and would sometimes trade favors or food for access to better water sources. The well water tastes better than the river water, prisoners would tell newcomers. Try to get your water from the well if you can. When ale was available, it was usually weak ale with low alcohol content. This ale was often safer to drink than water because the brewing process killed many harmful bacteria. However, ale was more expensive than water and not always available to poor prisoners. The brewing of ale for prisons was usually done by local brewers who had contracts with the prison. The ale was made from barley, hops, and water, then fermented for several days. Prison ale was typically of poor quality compared to ale sold to free customers, but it was still preferable to contaminated water. Wine was a luxury reserved for wealthy prisoners or special occasions. When wine was available in prisons, it was usually cheap, sour wine that wouldn't sell well in taverns. Even this poor quality wine was expensive for prisoners, costing several times what it would cost outside the prison walls. Vegetables played an important role in prison diets when they were available. The most common vegetables in medieval prisons were onions, cabbage, leeks, and root vegetables like turnips and parsnips. These vegetables were usually added to porridge or stew to provide flavor and nutrition. The availability of vegetables was highly seasonal. In late summer and fall, prisoners might receive fresh vegetables from local gardens and farms. In winter and early spring, vegetables were scarce and expensive. Preserved vegetables like sauerkraut or pickled onions were sometimes available, but they were costly and not always accessible to poor prisoners. Fresh cabbage in the stew today, a prisoner might announce excitedly to his cellmates. Really, that's the first fresh vegetable we've had in weeks, another would reply. The preparation of vegetables in medieval prisons was usually very simple. They were typically boiled in large pots, either alone or added to porridge or meat stew. Seasoning was minimal, usually just salt when it was available. Herbs were sometimes used in prison cooking, though they were not common. Common herbs like parsley, thyme, and sage might be added to stew if they were available. Some prisons had small herb gardens where basic cooking herbs were grown. Cheese was another food that was available to prisoners who could afford it. Medieval cheese was usually hard cheese that could be stored for long periods without spoiling. The cheese served in prisons was typically of poor quality, often made from the milk of animals that were past their prime. The taste of prison cheese was often described as strong, bitter, or rancid. However, cheese provided valuable protein and fat, making it an important part of the diet for prisoners who could obtain it. "This cheese smells terrible," a prisoner might say. "Hold your nose and eat it anyway," his cellmate might advise. You need the nourishment. Eggs were occasionally available in medieval prisons, usually chicken eggs though, sometimes eggs from other birds. Fresh eggs were expensive and rare in prison settings. More commonly, prisoners might receive preserved eggs that had been stored in salt or other preservatives. The preparation of eggs in prison was usually simple boiling. Fried or scrambled eggs required fat for cooking, which was expensive and not always available. Boiled eggs could be prepared in large batches and distributed easily to prisoners. Fruits were a rare treat in medieval prisons. When available, they were usually apples, pears, or berries that were in season locally. Dried fruits like raisins or dried apples were sometimes available but were expensive luxuries.
"Apple cores for sale,"
a vendor might call out as she walked through the prison corridors. Even apple cores, with their small amount of remaining fruit, were valuable to hungry prisoners. The seasonal nature of fruit availability meant that prisoners might go months without tasting any fruit at all. During harvest season, those who could afford it might enjoy fresh apples or pears, but these treats were brief and expensive. Nuts were another occasional food in medieval prisons. Walnuts, hazelnuts, and chestnuts were sometimes available during their harvest seasons. Nuts provided valuable nutrition, including protein and healthy fats, but they were considered luxury items and priced accordingly. The storage of nuts in prison presented challenges because they could become rancid or infested with insects. Prisoners who received nuts often ate them immediately rather than trying to save them for later. Let's talk about the daily routine surrounding food in medieval prisons. The day typically began before dawn, with the preparation of the morning meal. Prison cooks, usually the jailer's wife or servants, would start fires in the kitchen and begin preparing porridge or heating leftover stew from the previous day. The sound of activity in the kitchen was often the first sign to prisoners that the day was beginning. They would hear the crackling of fires being lit, the scraping of pots being moved, and the footsteps of cooks moving around the kitchen. They're starting breakfast. Prisoners would whisper to each other as they heard the familiar sounds. The actual serving of food was a carefully orchestrated process. The jailer would gather wooden bowls and cups, fill them with food, and begin his rounds through the prison. Each prisoner knew approximately when their turn would come based on the location of their cell. "Morning meal," the jailer would call out as he began his rounds. The sound of his voice and footsteps would create a ripple of anticipation throughout the prison. Prisoners would position themselves at their cell doors, ready to receive their bowls through the small openings. The exchange was usually brief and businesslike. "Here's your porridge," the jailer might say as he slid a bowl through the opening. "Thank you," the prisoner would reply, though gratitude was often mixed with disappointment at the small portion or poor quality. The evening meal followed a similar pattern, though it was often the larger meal of the day. Evening meals might include meat or vegetables if they were available, and prisoners looked forward to this meal with greater anticipation. Between meals, prisoners had to find ways to occupy their time and cope with hunger. Those who had money might purchase additional food from vendors, but poor prisoners simply had to endure the long hours between meals. How long until the evening meal was a common question among prisoners as the day wore on. Too long would usually be the answer. The social dynamics around mealtime were complex and important. Prisoners who received larger portions or better food might share with less fortunate cellmates, creating bonds of friendship and obligation. Those who hoarded their food might find themselves isolated and unpopular. "I can't finish all this bread," a prisoner might say, though his portion was actually quite small. "Would you like some?" This kind of generosity, even when resources were scarce, helped maintain humanity and community among prisoners facing difficult circumstances. The cleanup after meals was usually the responsibility of the prisoners themselves. They were expected to clean their own bowls and cups, though without soap or clean water. This cleaning was often inadequate. Dirty eating utensils contributed to the spread of disease in crowded prison conditions. Religious observances significantly affected prison meal schedules and content. During Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, even prisoners were expected to fast or eat simple foods. This meant no meat, and often reduced portions overall. "It's Lent," the jailer might announce. "No meat for the next 40 days. Fish if you can pay for it. Otherwise bread and porridge." Some prisoners welcomed the structure that religious observances brought to their lives, while others saw it as additional hardship on top of their already difficult circumstances. Feast days and holy days sometimes brought better food to prisons, especially if local religious communities or wealthy donors provided special meals. Christmas, Easter, and other major holidays might include meat, ale, or even sweets for prisoners. "It's Christmas Day," prisoners might remind each other. "Maybe we'll get something special to eat." These special meals were eagerly anticipated and provided bright spots in otherwise dreary prison existence. However, they were also reminders of the celebrations and family gatherings that prisoners were missing while incarcerated. The health consequences of poor prison nutrition were severe and long-lasting. Many prisoners developed scurvy from lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. This disease caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, and weakness. Without proper nutrition, wounds healed slowly and prisoners were susceptible to various infections. Malnutrition was common among long-term prisoners, especially those who couldn't afford to supplement their basic rations. Prisoners often became thin and weak, with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. Some never fully recovered their health even after release. "You look like a skeleton," a newly arrived prisoner might say to a long-term inmate. "You'll look the same if you stay here long enough," would be the grim reply. The psychological effects of poor food were as significant as the physical effects. Hunger was a constant companion for many prisoners, affecting their ability to think clearly and maintain hope for the future. The anticipation of meals became one of the few pleasures available to prisoners. Dreams about food were common among prisoners. They would often dream about meals they had eaten before their imprisonment, or fantasize about foods they would eat after release. These dreams provided temporary escape from their harsh reality but also intensified their awareness of what they were missing. "I dreamed about my mother's cooking last night," a prisoner might tell his cellmate. "Don't torture yourself with such thoughts," the cellmate might reply, though he probably had similar dreams himself. The economics of prison food created opportunities for entrepreneurship among some prisoners. Those with skills or resources might find ways to improve their food situation through trading, cooking, or providing services to other prisoners. Some prisoners became skilled at identifying which vendors offered the best value for money. They might advise newcomers about which foods to buy and which to avoid. "Don't buy the meat from the woman with the red scarf," an experienced prisoner might warn. "It's always spoiled. The baker's daughter has better food, but she charges more." This kind of information was valuable currency among prisoners, helping newcomers navigate the complex social and economic systems within the prison walls. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life had profound effects on prison food. Spring brought hope for fresh foods, but also the reality of depleted winter stores. Summer provided the best variety and quality of food for those who could afford it. Fall brought harvest abundance, but also the knowledge that winter hardships were approaching. Winter was the most challenging time for prison food. Fresh foods disappeared, prices increased, and heating costs competed with food costs in prison budgets. Prisoners had to survive on preserved foods and whatever could be stored from the harvest season. "Winter's coming," prisoners would say to each other as the days grew shorter. "Time to prepare for the hungry months." The preparation for winter often meant trying to save money for food purchases or arranging for family members to provide additional support during the difficult months ahead. Prison kitchens in winter had to rely heavily on preserved foods. Salted meat, dried fish, stored grain, and root vegetables formed the basis of winter prison diets. Fresh foods were rare and extremely expensive. The contrast between winter and summer prison food was dramatic. A prisoner who experienced both seasons would notice the difference immediately. "Remember when we had fresh vegetables in the stew?" Prisoners might reminisce during cold winter months. "That seems like a lifetime ago," another might reply as they ate their thin winter porridge. The role of local agriculture in determining prison food cannot be overstated. Prisons located in areas with good farmland had access to more varied and affordable food than those in areas with poor soil or harsh climates. Coastal prisons might have better access to fish, while prisons in grain-growing regions might have better bread. Mountain prisons might rely more heavily on preserved foods and have less variety overall. The prisons near the coast get fresh fish. Prisoners in inland locations might say enviously, "Yes, but we get better grain than they do." Others might reply, trying to find some advantage in their situation. Trade routes also affected prison food availability. Prisons located along major trade routes might have access to imported foods, spices, and specialty items that weren't available in more remote locations. The impact of war and political instability on prison food was severe. During times of conflict, food became scarce and expensive for everyone, but prisoners were particularly vulnerable because they couldn't forage, hunt, or trade for food themselves. "The war is making everything more expensive," jailers might explain as they reduced portions or increased prices. Prisoners during wartime often faced extreme hardships, with some surviving on minimal rations for extended periods. The food situation in prisons during these times was often desperate. The treatment of different types of prisoners also affected their access to food. Political prisoners, who might be exchanged or ransomed, were sometimes treated better than common criminals. Prisoners held for debt might be treated differently than those convicted of violent crimes. "He's a political prisoner," other inmates might whisper about a newcomer. "He'll probably eat better than the rest of us." This differential treatment created tensions among prisoners and reinforced social hierarchies even within prison walls. The role of prison chaplains and religious figures in improving food conditions was sometimes significant. Religious leaders who visited prisons often advocated for better treatment of prisoners, including improved food. The chaplain says we should get better food. Prisoners might tell each other hopefully. Chaplains say many things. More cynical prisoners might reply. But the jailer controls the food. Some religious figures did succeed in improving prison conditions, organizing donations or pressuring authorities to provide better care for prisoners. However, these improvements were often temporary and dependent on the continued involvement of sympathetic religious leaders. The long-term effects of medieval prison food experiences stayed with former prisoners for the rest of their lives. Many never forgot the hunger they experienced in prison and remained grateful for adequate food long after their release. "I never waste food anymore," a former prisoner might tell his family. "I remember what it's like to be truly hungry." These experiences often made former prisoners more sympathetic to others facing hunger and hardship, creating a lasting impact that extended beyond their prison sentences. The medieval prison food system, with all its inequalities and hardships, reflected the broader social values of the time. The expectation that prisoners would pay for their own food was consistent with medieval ideas about personal responsibility and the limited role of government in providing for individual needs. Today, we recognize that adequate nutrition is a basic human right that shouldn't depend on a person's ability to pay. The medieval approach to prison food seems cruel and unjust by modern standards, but it was consistent with the social and legal frameworks of its time. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the progress that has been made in criminal justice and human rights. It also reminds us that the way we treat the most vulnerable members of society reflects our deepest values and commitments. The next time you sit down to a meal, perhaps you'll think about those long-ago prisoners and appreciate not only the abundance and variety that we often take for granted today, but also the recognition that all people deserve adequate nutrition regardless of their circumstances or ability to pay.